Now we're ready to make the player jump. Let's go into our scripts folder and create a new script called jump. When it comes to adding behaviors like jump or moving forward, I like to break them out into their own little scripts. This way everything is reusable, and also it only has to focus on doing one simple task, in this case making our player jump. We'll connect the player jump to the input state so that the jump class has some sort of knowledge of what the player is doing without having to know really much about the player itself. Let's open this up in MonoDevelop. At the top of our class, let's add a few properties. First, we're going to need a public float that represents the jump speed. Here we'll set this to 240. Next, we're going to need a reference to the rigid body 2D and the input state on the game object. Let's create a private property for rigid body 2D called body 2D, and we'll also create a private property called input state for the input state. Next, let's make a new awake method, and in it we'll set the body 2D and input state values to their respective components. Now we're not going to use the start method inside of our jump class, so let's remove that. And instead, in update, we're going to take a look at how to actually make the player jump. The first thing we want to do is test that the player is actually standing. If the player is standing on something, we can then test if the action button has been pressed. Now, if that's happened, we can set the body 2D's velocity to equal a new vector 2. We'll make the x value 0 so that the player jumps straight up, and we'll make the y value jump speed. It's important to note that our jump speed is positive. That's because in order to move up in Unity, we'll use a positive value. To move down, it's usually a negative value along the y-axis. Let's save this and drag the jump script over to our player. Now we can run the game, and any button you press should make the player jump. Now as you jump and try to avoid objects, you may notice something. If you land on an object, you'll notice it'll drag the player towards the left-hand side of the screen. You can still jump off of it, but there's no way to jump forward. Let's go back into our jump script and add another property. Here we'll do a public float, and we'll call this forward speed. And we'll set this to 20. Now let's modify this position here. Basically, we only want the player to jump forward if they're past the center point of the screen. And since we know that the center point of the screen is going to be 0, we need to simply test if the player's position x is less than 0. If that's the case, we'll apply the forward speed. If not, we'll default it to 0. So let's add that in real quick. We'll need to type in transform position x and see that it is less than 0. If it is, we'll use the forward speed. If it's false, we'll simply use 0 so that the player jumps up. Now let's save this and rerun our game. Now try to jump on an object and stand on it. Here, you'll see I can now jump from one object to another. If I keep jumping, I'll be moving forward. Once I hit the center of the screen, though, I no longer jump any further forward. So now we've added a little bit of strategy to our game to help the player out in case they fall behind an object. The other thing to note, though, and I'll re-demonstrate this by playing it again, is that once you hit an object, even though we can jump forward, because the object is going to be bigger than the arc we need to get the player to jump, they're always going to get pinned behind an object. And that's fine. That's going to be part of our game. You're going to have to time your jumps correctly so that you jump over an object and don't get pulled off the screen by them. Next, we'll look into adding an idle animation so that when the player lands on an object, they don't look like they're still running on it, even though they're not moving.